You're watching a free sample video from Teacher's Test Prep. For videos like this one covering every area of your exam, visit us today at www.teacherstestprep.com.
Styles of theater. There are many, many different styles of theater from different cultures and different parts of the world and different times in history. But here are a few key ones that are good examples to know for the exam. First of all, Aristotelian theater, based on the works of Aristotle. He was an Athenian back in ancient Greece, and he wrote something called the Poetics, where he discussed a lot of the elements of what a well-written play should be, and a lot of the structure, the dramatic structure that we use in storytelling today, especially theatrical storytelling, owes itself to Aristotle's early works. Aristotle also believed in what he called three unities that should exist in a well-written play: the unity of time, place, and action. By the unity of time, he meant that everything should happen in one sort of sequential period of time. You don't flash forward in time, you don't jump back in time. By unity of place, he meant it should all happen in one location. And by unity of action, he meant it should be either a comedy or a tragedy. So his definitions of a comedy and tragedy are very different than the ones we use today. By the Aristotelian, or the ancient Greek definition, a comedy was any story in which the protagonist was victorious. Remember, the protagonist is whoever you're rooting for. And a tragedy is any story in which the protagonist was not victorious. So in Aristotle's definition, Jaws would be a comedy because the protagonists are victorious. Of course, we wouldn't look for that in the comedy section of our video rental anymore. One other term that's good to know that goes back to the ancient Greeks in drama is what we call deus ex machina. Deus ex machina, which means God from the machine. And in Greek drama, there was this idea that it was sort of as to show reverence to the gods had to come and resolve the story. So a person playing a god would be lowered down on this machine, which is where that term comes from. And then they would come onto the stage and they would resolve the story at the end. And sometimes in stories today, we complain about the idea of this deus ex machina, the idea that something outside the characters resolve the story. So for example, in Jaws, if instead of the main characters defeating the shark, everybody just got killed by a big storm and it had nothing to do with the shark, we would sort of feel like that was a terrible ending to the story. We would call that deus ex machina, like something outside came in and resolved it. Kabuki Theatre is a great example of an Eastern style of theater. And in a lot of Eastern theatrical styles, there's a sort of incorporation of music and pageantry, sometimes puppetry, all sorts of elements kind of combine into the art forms that we see in the East. And Kabuki Theatre is a great example of that. Colorful makeup and costumes, melodramatic plot lines, there's a lot of dance, there's a lot of music, there's action scenes on stage. This term melodramatic is good to know. It basically means heightened drama, and you might think of it like if you see a soap opera where people seem like they're overacting, right? But I always loved you. That's sort of like overacting that we see. That heightened drama is called melodrama, and sometimes it's just bad acting. But in certain cases, like in the tradition of Kabuki Theatre, it was an intentional dramatic choice, and that's the way they performed. It's also good to note the difference between screen acting and stage acting. When actors originally came to the screen and were acting on film, they were often really kind of overacting in our view. And that's because when you're on stage, you need to project more, you need to have bigger expressions because people way out in the back row need to be able to see and understand what you're doing. Whereas when those same actors came to the screen, now with the camera right there, it didn't necessitate that sort of big over-the-top performance. It needed a more naturalistic performance style. And you see things like this with people like Marlon Brando originating more naturalistic acting styles, and you compare them to other actors that surrounded them in movies like, for example, A Streetcar Named Desire, and you see a much older, more melodramatic acting style. So that transition from stage to screen is actually something that they've sometimes asked about on the test as it relates to the differences in the acting styles. Shakespearean theater. Shakespearean theater is based, of course, on the works of William Shakespeare, who was certainly one of the most influential playwrights of the modern era. And he came up with a lot of plot devices and complexities and things that still is borrowed from in a lot of writing today. Shakespeare's writing evolved through a number of major periods. Beginning with comedies, things like A Midsummer Night's Dream, then went into histories, things like Henry V, and then he sort of had a lot of tragedies in his later works. So things like Hamlet or Macbeth are good examples of Shakespearean tragedies. Sometimes on the exam, you'll also be asked about types of staging in different styles of theater. And these are 4 good ones to know for the test. First of all, proscenium staging. This is the style of staging that we're used to seeing with most of the plays we probably go to. And this is a style that also was typical in a lot of traditional theatrical styles that we talked about. You basically had a proscenium arch, an archway, where the curtain gets pulled across. And that proscenium arch separates the fictional world of the characters from the real world of the audience that's looking in through that sort of picture window, so to speak. Sometimes they also refer to it as the fourth wall, the wall that separates, that imaginary wall that separates the world of the performers from the world of the audience. With open staging, you have a stage that sort of juts out into the audience. And as you can see here, the audience sort of surrounds the stage, and that changes aspects of the staging. For example, with proscenium staging, the audience is sort of looking from one major angle, so all the performers sort of cheat towards that angle and perform in that direction. And you also can have a background behind them because there's no one sitting back there or looking from the sides. But with open staging, people are looking from the sides, and that means the performers need to turn in different directions and can't just play in one direction. And it also means that the sets and the props need to not block people's views from the different directions. So it changes the design aspects as well. Theater in the round takes this one step further. Now people are sitting all around the stage, 360 degrees around it. So that means you're going to have sort of a more natural movement of the actors in some ways, because instead of everyone trying to point in one direction because the audience is there, people are going to look in from all directions. So sometimes you'll be looking at one character from the back and the other one from the front. So it changes those aspects of how they perform and how they block the scene. And it also certainly affects what the sets can be, because you can't have just a background because people from the other side wouldn't be able to see the performers over that background. So that's a different way of staging and designing the whole production. Lastly, environmental staging means basically that there's no clear distinction between the world of the audience and the world of the performers. They use that whole environment as their stage. So perhaps characters move throughout the audience. Maybe they even interact with audience members and things like that. That's an example of environmental staging. So these are 4 great ones to know for the test in terms of staging.
We hope you found this free Teacher's Test Prep sample video helpful. For more videos like this one covering all the subject matter and strategy you need to pass your exam, visit us today at www.teacherstestprep.com.